You can love this country, but you have the right to criticize it, and you have the right to seek out improvement and know that it can be better.
You have to be mature to be a patriot, because it assumes you are mature enough to know that you have certain responsibilities to be a citizen of your country. What it does not mean is I go to political rallies and I hold up a sign. That doesn't solve anything.
It's important to reclaim patriotism, that civic pride is a noble quality. Of course, it can be misused.
Hey, it's Julie, and this is Top of Mind, where we tackle tough topics with nuance and an open mind. We're out to become better citizens, kinder neighbors, and more effective advocates. For 25 years, Gallup has been polling Americans about how proud they are to be American. And today that number is at an all-time low. Barely half, 58%, say they're extremely or very proud to be American. This decline has been steady since the early 2000s, but it has been more dramatic in just the last decade. And I guess the question's, well, so what? On the one hand, national pride does seem to have a worrisome way of sliding into xenophobia and the desire to protect our own interests at the expense of others. At the same time, research clearly shows that people who feel pride in their country are more likely to vote, write their members of Congress, and volunteer in their communities. So what happens to civic life if the majority of people in a country no longer feel patriotic? And while we're at it, what does it even mean to be patriotic? I always think about the swell that I sometimes feel when singing the national anthem or seeing the flag wave over my hometown. Is there more to it, though? Can marching in a protest, for example, be patriotic? Is there room for criticism alongside pride in country? Well, that's what we're unpacking today on Top of Mind. This episode was actually prompted by a listener who emailed me the week after the 4th of July, asking how she could regain a sense of patriotism when she feels apologetic about what our country currently stands for. And there was a real sense of sadness in her tone that surprised me. So I called her up to learn a little bit more. It turns out her story is about loss. We'll call her Susan.
I used to feel patriotic, especially, around July 4th and all those things. I used to feel like a real sense of ownership, I guess, of our country. Like I was part of it and like it represented me and I was happy to be American. And lately, I guess I've felt less of that.
Now, Susan says this isn't about any specific political party in power. She's politically independent. And looking back, she says her patriotism actually started waning in the late 2000s.
In thinking about it, I've decided that part of the reason that I feel less proud of the country is that it's just so divided. I feel like we've become so focused on what's good for us and what we perceive as being the most advantageous for the U.S., that we're kind of leaving people behind, people that we've always been there for. And I think pointing fingers and asking what's in it for me and how can I get ahead and stirring up people to think, oh, it's all that group's fault for what's going on. Like, it seems like we're fighting against each other and everyone else, but there's no unity, and we are the United States. So I feel like we should be united in purpose and values.
Susan reached out to me again as we were finishing up this episode to say how the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk and the politically divisive response to his murder have her feeling even more concerned about this lack of unity in America. How can we value and help others see the value of every human life, she wrote, independent of anything a person does or believes? I admit I didn't really see the connection between unity and patriotism at first. If patriotism is about pride in country, what's unity got to do with that? But longtime public opinion analyst Carlin Bowman set me straight on this. She's a senior fellow emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute. And she points to the last time patriotism was really high, over 90% in America. It was right after the 9/11 terror attacks back in 2001.
I think it was a huge shock to the American psyche. And George W. Bush's talk immediately after that, I think, was also very important in uniting the nation.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong.
I think it's not surprising that a real shock to the system would cause patriotism to spike.
We haven't had another foreign terrorist attack on U.S. soil since then, and we haven't seen another spike in American patriotism either. Instead, we saw a significant drop in 2016, says Bowman.
We are deeply polarized and deeply divided, and does a Democrat who really dislikes Trump want to say to a pollster, well, I'm really patriotic, when he doesn't feel very happy about the country?
So Bowman's making a really important point here about the patriotic polling data. While the overall percentage of people who are willing to say they're extremely or very proud to be American is just 58%, which is an all-time low, the picture is much different when you break the answers down by political party. Democrats have always been less patriotic in these polls. But from 2001 up until, you guessed it, 2016, the percentage of Democrats saying they were extremely or very proud to be American hovered around 80%, really high. Then it took a nosedive when President Trump was elected, rallied a bit when Biden was in office, and it's back down now to a mere 38% of Democrats who are extremely or very proud to be American. Meanwhile, patriotism among Republicans has remained at or above 90% for the entire 25 years we're talking about here. Even during the Biden administration, patriotism among Republicans was 30 to 40 percentage points higher than among Democrats. So what's the deal? Why are Democrats so down on America? Well, Carlin Bowman, the polling expert, thinks it's way more complicated than that.
Republicans are more willing to say that they're patriotic than Democrats, but I don't think that necessarily means that Democrats are less patriotic. They're just less willing to express the sentiment to a pollster or express the sentiment generally. And I think, too, if you look at people with higher levels of education, they're less likely to express patriotic attitudes than those with less formal education.
People who voted for Democrats in 2024 were more likely to have a college degree. So that's why she's making this connection.
The educational system, I think, in some ways makes you think in a different way about concepts such as patriotism, and you're less willing to have the rah-rah ideas often associated with patriotism. But I don't think that means that Democrats are less patriotic than Republicans.
Now, this makes me think of Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations theory, which attempts to explain why we're divided about politics and religion. He identifies a series of foundational morals that shape our societal rules and priorities. Broadly speaking, Haidt finds that liberals tend to be especially attuned to suffering of vulnerable groups, to injustice, and to cheating, while being less easily outraged by disloyalty, disrespect for authority, or violations of things that are considered sacred. Conservatives, on the other hand, place much greater value on loyalty, authority, and sanctity, which happen to align with more conventional notions of patriotism, right? So it makes complete sense that Republicans would be highly patriotic regardless of what's going on in the country. Now, there's one other interesting divide in the Gallup polls to point out. Gen Z is way less patriotic than us older generations. But Bowman says that's not just a Gen Z thing. Young people, she says, are always less patriotic.
I think it's just because they don't have a stake in the society yet. They haven't developed those things like marriages, mortgages, and families that tend to give you a stake and a feeling of how important it is to be an American.
And just like their parents and grandparents before them, Bowman says today's youth will likely become more patriotic with time. Carlin Bowman is a senior fellow emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute and a public opinion analyst. In working on this episode, it became clear to me that a big reason questions around patriotism feel so fraught right now is that the whole idea has been captured by the extremes. You either hate America or you love it blindly. Polarization is our specialty in America these days, after all. So in the last segment of today's show, we will consider the possibility of reclaiming patriotism for the rest of us. But first, we're going to hear from two people with very different backgrounds and perspectives on what patriotism means in their own lives.
I don't know if the word proud or not proud is really the best way to describe it, but I would hesitate to say that this country has no room for improvement.
I'm proud of the fact that there are certain American values that make us better. And yes, I use the term better.
That's next. I'm Julie Rose. This is Top of Mind with the BYU Radio Podcast Network. Okay, Top of Mind listeners, before we get right back to today's episode, I would like to introduce you to another gem of a show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's In Good Faith. It's hosted by Stephen Cap Perry, and on each episode, he interviews members of different religions and spiritualities to better understand their relationship with the divine. Whether you wish to strengthen your own relationship or just listen to thoughtful conversations about religion, dive into an enriching world of spiritual exploration with Stephen Cap Perry on In Good Faith. Listen anywhere you get podcasts. When you break down the patriotism polling data by race, you quickly see that Americans who identify as white are the most likely to call themselves very patriotic. The least likely are those who identify as Black. Patriotism is complicated for many African Americans, says Michelle Duster.
What makes it complicated is that African Americans in general, obviously there are exceptions, but as a group have not had the same level of protections and opportunities as specifically European Americans.
Michelle Duster is an author and historian who writes often about racial injustice in America.
When you're kind of asked to pledge allegiance to the flag, but knowing that all of the words that are in that pledge have not applied to you, and I mean, this, people act like it's ancient history, but my great-grandmother, who was my grandmother's mother, was born into slavery. So to me, that's not ancient history when you're talking about, like, I knew my grandmother very well, and her mother was born into slavery.
Duster's great-grandmother was famous journalist and civil rights activist Ida B. Wells, who risked her life exposing the horrors of lynching in the South in the 1890s.
She went to sites where lynching had happened and talked to people on the ground and got firsthand testimony of what happened, which is super dangerous work because you're literally going to a crime scene.
And Wells petitioned the president for anti-lynching legislation.
I mean, to me, that's an incredibly patriotic thing to do, to go to the president of the United States and say, look, we need to change the laws of this country so that everybody has equal protection under the law.
And Ida B. Wells was frequently condemned as unpatriotic for that, even anti-American.
She was a very controversial person during her time, well hated by some people, but if you can't push a country to be more than it is if you don't care, so I think if you do care to the point where you're willing to put your life on the line, to fight and push and challenge, that is one of the biggest forms of patriotism.
So that's the context for Michelle Duster's feelings about patriotism as an African-American writer who's also been accused of being unpatriotic for writing about racial injustice. And when I ask if she considers herself patriotic, Duster hesitates a bit.
Yes. I think that the United States is a good idea as far as what it can become. And I recognize that we, as Americans, do have rights that some other people can only dream about. But I also believe that we have not lived up to our full potential. I mean, people think if you don't say this country is perfect, that nothing needs to be changed. It's exactly, there's no room for improvement at all. We're just, utopia. I think that is being disingenuous, because everything can improve. But to think that there is absolutely no room for improvement, and if you express that, then you're not a patriot, I'm paraphrasing, but James Baldwin basically said, that you can love this country but you have the right to criticize it, and you have the right to seek out improvement and know that it can be better. If you kind of think about it like a house, I mean, why do people do home improvements? You see something that can be improved, and so then you decide, oh, okay, well, maybe this needs a coat of paint, or maybe we need to replace the cabinets, or whatever you're doing. And so it's not like you don't love your house, but you just see something that you think can be better.
So what about the public rituals of patriotism that many Americans value? Polling by YouGov finds Black Americans are less likely than white Americans to own an American flag, and they're much less likely to consider flying a flag to be an act of patriotism. And while American athletes of many races have protested during the national anthem, Black athletes in particular have faced criticism for it. Again, says Duster, it's complicated.
I mean, I've never refused to stand for the national anthem. I mean, I think it's a lot to ask of people to ignore injustice and, and just sort of have this robotic, forced kind of way of expressing that, sort of a symbolic way that everything is perfect and there's nothing, to even talk about. I don't know. I mean, I think specifically when it comes to the NFL players kneeling during the national anthem, I mean, that was a very high-profile way and very nonviolent, way to demonstrate that they were not in alliance with the way that this country was treating police brutality. I mean, I get it. Some people want to just go to a football game or any kind of sporting and just be entertained. They don't feel like having politics, interrupt their fun. And I mean, that almost goes back to Muhammad Ali also, when he was protesting.
Muhammad Ali had his heavyweight title stripped, and he was banned from boxing when he refused to fight in the Vietnam War in 1967. He said going to war would violate his religious beliefs as a Muslim, and felt he couldn't fight for a country that continued to oppress Black people. Americans consider serving in the military to be one of the most patriotic things you can do. And yet, here again, Duster points out,
Black people have fought in every single war that this country has had, but missed some of the benefits of being veterans. The veterans from specifically World War II were excluded from the GI Bill, which built the middle class. So you're fighting for a country overseas and being treated better in some of the countries, especially France and some parts of Northern Africa, as soldiers than they had been treated in their own country, the United States. And then when they came back to this country, after fighting for freedom and democracy overseas to free other people, they were still asked to, go to the back of the bus, drink out of separate water fountains, were terrorized while wearing their uniform in some situations. And so that's complicated because you're sort of, quote, good enough to fight for the country and for what the country is supposed to be and on behalf of the country for other people's freedom. But then you come back to your country and have less freedom than you had in another country.
Duster wrote an article for Rebellious magazine back in 2024 that captured the root of her complicated feelings about patriotism in America. It's one of the reasons we reached out to her for this episode. And that article was titled, "People of Color Do Not Need to Prove Patriotism."
And it came up because I was talking to an Asian immigrant who had recently become a naturalized citizen. And he was like, well, I don't understand why people feel like that I'm not really an American, even though I was naturalized. Like, what do I need to do to show that I'm really like a true American? And that made me start thinking about, is there something? Is there a particular action, or is there a particular expectation that people need to meet in order for other people to accept you as a true American? And I feel that there are some people who will it's very difficult for them to think specifically of people of color to ever be true Americans. Because, and I've experienced that where it's like, well, where are you from? I'm from the United States. So where are you really from? Where are your grandparents from? And so then people want to go back 10 generations to figure out if you're, quote, real American or not. So my conclusion is that there is nothing you can really do. There's never enough because it doesn't matter. You can put your life on the line. You can get Purple Hearts, but then it's still like, yeah, but you're not really from here. You're not really American. So I feel that there is no need to prove anything. If you live in this country and you're doing the right thing by this country, then you don't have to do somersaults and cartwheels and everything in order to, have somebody else decide if you're American or not.
Michelle Duster is an author, historian, and the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells. So let's round out this picture now with the perspective of somebody with no hesitancy to declare his pride in America.
I'm Doug Satterfield. I'm retired from the United States Army in 2014, just a little short of 40 years.
Tell me what's on your business card.
It says American Patriot.
So what does that mean?
It's just simply as love of country. That's really all it is. And there's a lot more to it than love of country. It means that we recognize that America is a great country.
Satterfield is a Republican. He's a leadership consultant and an advocate for veterans, and he's got a blog called The Leader Maker, where he posts articles about leadership, his support for the Trump administration, and his frustration with liberals. A couple essays that caught our attention for this episode were titled Why I'm an American Patriot and This Veteran Doesn't Kneel. Satterfield enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1974 and eventually deployed to Iraq during the War on Terror 6 times.
I did 3 total years in Iraq.
3 total years, wow.
Yeah, this long time. My parents used to ask if I owned a home and was married or something over there. And I said, no, it's different. It's different.
Now, contrary to what you might expect, given how we tend to see military service as an act of patriotism, Satterfield says he did not enlist out of a sense of duty or national pride.
I grew up in the Deep South, and in the Deep South, there's a very strong military culture. That's just what you did. I would not say I was a strong patriot at that time. I was pretty immature, but things changed over time. And the more time I spent overseas, the more time I'm like, I don't particularly like what I see here. In the 70s, I was in Germany, Italy, and England. And in the latter times, I was in Canada. I've been to Saudi Arabia, Belgium, Cuba, Panama. And then more recently, obviously, Iraq, Kuwait, South Korea. The constitutional system, I think, quite frankly, is brilliant. Obviously, we're a constitutional republic. Generically, we're a democracy. But the system is stood for a very, very long period of time. And as you read it, or if you go into the Federalist Papers and read some of them, they're like, these are pretty smart folks who put this together. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that there are certain American values that are not necessarily the values of other countries that make us better. And yes, I use the term better. We value honesty and integrity, independence, and hard work. And we value our family, our legal systems. We're also a defender of the helpless. We believe in our faith in God. And if you put all that together, that's a lot, because there are some countries, if you say you believe in God, they will put you in jail.
Okay, so here's where Doug Satterfield really threw me for a loop. Given what he just outlined and what it says on his business card and the tenor of his blog articles, I assumed that there would be no room for calling out America's flaws in his definition of patriotism, which just goes to show the risk of making broad assumptions about people based on labels like Republican or veteran.
You have to be mature to be a patriot, because it assumes, I believe, that you are mature enough to know that you have certain responsibilities to be a citizen of your country. And that means that recognizing that there are problems, because there's no perfect human system, and that you are part of the solution to help making those things better. What it does not mean is I go to political rallies and I hold up a sign and rah-rah. I don't do any of that kind of stuff, because that's not necessarily being a patriot. There's a place for that, But we got to do more than that. That doesn't solve anything. So what do? Call your representative, write letters, go to the State House is a good place to start. The way I do things, if there's an issue, let me give you an example. Veterans were not getting the COVID shot. If you remember, there was a priority ranking of those who could get the shots. As an example, first responders, teachers, those coming in contact with people daily.
Right, when it very first became available.
Very first. The veterans were pretty far down the list. In fact, they were behind prisoners, which was fairly upsetting to many of us, as you can imagine. So I went to our state representative and the 2 senators in the state and said, hey, we need to do something about it. There's a small group of us in southern Jersey. It's a coalition of folks here that say, hey, we will help draft some legislation, examples for you to help get the veterans higher on the list. They actually introduced the legislation. They did some great stuff. They said, all you have to do initially is just self-identify as a veteran and we'll give you the shot. And your spouse and a caretaker. And they threw that in. I thought that was great.
And that was a patriotic act for you to advocate through the government system.
Right.
Because it was helping.
It was helping.
And for Satterfield, the highest expression of patriotism is working for the good of others in your community. Maybe that's serving in the military, but it could also be running for office or lobbying government officials for a policy change or volunteering in your community.
I live in a community that's run by a large number of volunteers. We probably have several hundred volunteers in a community of about 1,400 that are helping do all sorts of jobs around, and that cuts down on the cost, and it's good for everybody.
Okay, but let's be clear here. The traditional markers of patriotism also matter to Doug Satterfield. He says he is bothered when people don't stand for the national anthem.
I don't like that. I can tell you that. I'll be upfront because, what symbols are important. I study a lot about the Civil War. I had relatives in the Civil War. I had them in the Revolutionary War, too. But in the Civil War, my great-great-great-great-grandfather carried the American flag at Gettysburg. And at Gettysburg...
For the Union?
Yes, for the Union. And the flag bearers were always the first to get shot. Always. And the reason was it was easy to see them, okay? And they were always shooting to destroy the symbols. And in the Civil War, men in the battle and all the battles, if a flag hit the ground, they were going to pick it up and run with it with the knowledge that they were automatically becoming a target.
Did he die at Gettysburg then?
No, he did not. A miracle. He did not get killed. And he went through the whole thing, did not get killed. Yep. So it's pretty interesting to have that and to have the knowledge and to educate myself on those that came before me is part of patriotism too. You can't be ignorant about your past.
What do you think children ought to be taught? What kind of patriotism? Would you like to see patriotism taught in American schools today? What kinds of things would we be teaching kids?
I think they need to teach the history of the United States and teach it properly and show what are the good things and why. We've gotten away from, as an example, teaching about governments. We don't hardly do that anymore. They used to teach you, what was a dictatorship. They used to teach about what propaganda was. The primary purpose was so you don't fall for it. And now we teach history, but we focus on those things that are bad and kind of push aside those things that are good. So they're not being taught the basics of history, and they're not being taught anything they could legitimately be proud of about being an American. They're not taught those sort of things.
Doug Satterfield is a retired brigadier general in the U.S. Army, and he runs the blog The Leader Maker. Now, I promised you a conversation about how patriotism has been captured by the extremes, when, as we just heard from Michelle Duster and Doug Satterfield, there's actually a fair amount of overlap around what it means to be proud of America. Is there a kind of patriotism that more of us across the political spectrum could relate to, even agree on? Well, that's next on Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. I'm Julie Rose. We'll be right back to today's episode of Top of Mind, but first, Are you ready to immerse yourself in the awe-inspiring world of nature? Then I recommend you listen to Constant Wonder. It's another great show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Join host Marcus Smith in riveting conversations with individuals whose lives have been touched by Earth's beauty and mysteries. Uncover captivating stories that shed light on our planet's wonders, from history to science and beyond. If you crave enriching experiences and a deeper connection with the world around you, tune into Constant Wonder. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. Yale University political science professor Stephen Smith is not the guy you'd expect to write a book arguing for a rebirth of patriotism in America. He's a liberal Ivy League academic, and he admits he got a kick out of the looks of shock, horror, and occasional disgust on the faces of his colleagues when they found out what he was working on.
The book was in many ways written for people who are liberal, to argue for why it's important for liberals to reclaim patriotism, not to run away from this. That civic pride is a noble quality, like any quality. Of course, it can be misused. What can't be, but that's not a reason to run away from it or to refuse to endorse it. I like to tell this story. I mean, this is kind of what got the book started in a way. A number of years ago now, we'd been invited to some friend's house for a 4th of July cookout. And the hostess of the evening said to us, "Do you feel patriotic?" And I remember there was a distinct sense of kind of discomfort with the question, people a little uncomfortable about that. And then she asked, "Did anyone grow up at a house where they flew the flag outside?" She had. None of us had. And it was a little uncomfortable moment. But then, we read the Declaration of Independence, read it around, everybody read a sentence. And then we had our hot dogs and hamburgers and, had a food. But I began to think, why was it on the 4th of July, our national holiday, why did people feel uncomfortable at patriotism?
Because patriotism matters a lot, says Smith.
No democracy can persist, at least for long, without a sense of the loyalty and obligation of its citizens to sustain it. There really is a very real tendency to just cede authority to demagogues and strong men who, people say, well, let them do the job. And we see this throughout many places in the world, the emergence of authoritarian rulers and a kind of public passivity and the kind of lack of a civic spirit.
Smith's book is called Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. He says on one end of the spectrum is a view that sees no reason or need to be proud to be American. The most extreme version of this is an outright, I hate America. More often, though, says Smith, it's what he sees in many of his Ivy League students.
A certain kind of student think of themselves not as citizens of any particular country, but citizens of the world.
It's globalism that doesn't see nations as a force for good.
The globalist view tends to think of sovereign states as largely lacking the quality of global concern. And states are the source of conflict, states are the source of chauvinism, and that therefore they represent something to be overcome. The extreme form of that is the idea that America is somehow the original site of racism, of what's called settler colonialism, that sees America as, again, in many ways, the unique, not the soul, but the most powerful force representing these kind of tendencies of colonialism, racism, patriarchy. You know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. What's the other extreme then that is also adding to this confusion about the value of patriotism?
The other
in
extreme
America
is the nationalist extreme. There's an understandable, but I think a false tendency to associate patriotism with nationalism. And I think that's wrong. The two are quite distinct. Nationalism has become a much more belligerent ideology of dividing the world into us and them. That the nationalist believes that we live in a world of conflict and if I'm up, you must be down, and vice versa.
But Smith says nationalism is different from believing that America is best. He says patriotism has room for people to believe the United States has the best system of government, for example, without getting into nationalism territory. And Smith says it's okay to put the well-being of our nation above other interests.
There's a famous Jewish saying, goes back to Hillel, the famous rabbi, who said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" And that's not only true of individuals, it's true of countries and nations. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Of course. But I would also say Hillel followed that with a second question. But if I am only for myself, what am I?
What is our common ground if you lean one way or the other? What is the common thing, are the common things that we can sort of see eye to eye on as patriots?
That's a great question. And I'll start by saying there will always, we live in a large pluralistic society. We're always going to differ. My view of patriotism isn't about imposing some kind of uniformity on belief, but I think that we need a greater sense of what America stands for, and that despite many, many flaws. One charge against patriotism is that it ignores the flaws in one's country. I don't think that's necessary. I think a patriotic attitude can come with an honest reckoning of flaws and failure. But I think it comes with having a fundamentally positive assessment of the place of America in the world. I do maintain this kind of idealist view, as it were, that we are a kind of light to the nations. And I think we need to teach this, and that means not whitewashing slavery, not whitewashing the problems of the past. Ronald Reagan, nobody ever accused Ronald Reagan of not being patriotic. Ronald Reagan apologized to the Japanese Americans for their internship during the Second World War. He recognized an injustice and stood up, kind of manly of him, to acknowledge failure. That shows it shows a certain kind of superiority, that you are able to recognize your flaws and acknowledge them and improve on what you've done.
And Smith would love to see the United States implement a mandatory national service program to ignite civic pride in young people.
Students very much want to be a part of something. I teach at Yale, and it's kind of an elite place. And so many students, what do they do after college? They go to Wall Street, they go to finance, and they do this as a default because they don't know what else to do. They had 4 years of a top ed. What do they do? It's just soul crushing as a kind of alternative. I would love to see, and I think this would be something I think both the left and the right would agree to. They could have a military component to it. It could have a teaching component to it. It could have an environmental component to it. Put them in areas parts of the country where they haven't been to before. Let them meet people who think differently and build from this a kind of common sense of, we may come from different places and so on, but we may not be that fundamentally different.
And from that would come a sense of patriotism?
I think very much so. I think it would provide a kind of common experience that everyone could share in at some level, and take, again, a kind of pride in the fact that they have done something for their country. And then if they want to go to law school, or they want to do this, they want to do that, fine. But they have a kind of common, and that's so central to patriotism.
It seems so obvious now to me, but as you're describing the effect that having this national, maybe even mandatory service opportunity for young people as being an entry point to patriotism, I guess what it really says to me is that in order to be proud to be an American, you need to feel like you belong and are connected to other Americans. Absolutely. Like the community piece, we could even have like a very sort of an admiration for the founding fathers or for the Constitution. I could, in isolation, I could read the entire Constitution and the Federalist Papers and get this great sort of admiration for, but I'm not going to be proud to be an American unless I am connected to a community and I feel like I belong.
I think both of those are very much of a part with one another. Patriotism is first an ethos. It's a way of life. Like you say, it's a feeling, it's a sense of connection to your country, to its history, to a way of life. It is that. But in America, at least, patriotism also has a rational dimension, which is our commitment to certain ideals rooted in certain primary fundamental texts of the American founding, especially the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. These set forth not just a set of government, but a set of ideals to which we can aspire.
What kinds of individual actions do you think someone could take to rekindle a sense of patriotism in themselves?
One thing I've suggested, this may be a bit of a pipe dream, is engage with someone who you know thinks very differently from you on big national and political issues. Try to understand where they're coming from. Not in the idea of converting them to your side or patronizing them, but in the sense of trying to understand someone else.
Why would that help me feel more patriotic if I'm that person?
Because it might give you a sense that, these other people who it's easy to demonize if you just listen to the cable news shows and everything. You realize that they're a human being too. They may differ from you. They may have different views, but their views may not be crazy. They may not be evil. They think differently, but they have reasons. And if they have reasons, there's something to respect. I think liberals need to be educated in terms of reclaiming the decency of patriotism as a legitimate virtue and having a decent pride in one's country. But I also think conservatives need to be educated increasingly that love of country doesn't just mean America first. It means love of the ideals to which our country has aspired to over the course of our history.
Stephen Smith is a professor of political science at Yale University, and he's author of Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. I'll just add that becoming a poll worker has boosted my own feelings of patriotism. Greeting my neighbors, helping them vote on Election Day simultaneously deepens my respect for our form of democracy and also deepens my connection to the community. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Email topofmind@byu.edu. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Isabella Sosa and Teo Wolf, with help from Abby Karras, Samuel Benson, Sam Payne, and me. Our audio engineer is Hayden Thompson. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.